So welcome. Thank you for attending this morning. Just a bit of a welcome acknowledgement of country. So I acknowledge the traditional owners of the land on which we are meeting, and I pay my respects to their elders past and present and emerging, and the Aboriginal elders of other communities who may be here today. So the agenda for this morning, we're just going to go through what the opportunities are with Council to undertake procurement, the different types of procurement, how Council engages suppliers, our e-procurement portal, which is Tenderlink, our Moorabool localised initiative, what our procurement controls are and thresholds, the types of contracts that we enter into, how to prepare a successful submission, what the different parts of a tender document is, and how we go about our tender evaluation and approval processes, and where you can go for any further information that you may have. The opportunities in 21-22, our capital works program is $63.76 million, with opportunities in a range of different areas. So there's recreational facility opportunities, early year facility and building upgrades, depot upgrades, roads resurfacing, rehab and widening, culvert renewal, plant replacement, and then there's a whole range of other procurement processes that we undertake for consultancy or structure plans, service planning frameworks and strategy development. So the different types of procurement, we have request for quote, which is when we normally seek 3 quotes from different suppliers, and it's normally within the spend threshold of $5,000 to $150,000 or $5,000 to $200,000 if the project's for works. Public tender is anything for goods and services over 150,000 or for works over 200,000, and all public tenders are advertised on Tenderlink, in the local Moorabool News printed media, and via the Moorabool Shire Council Economic Development Corp Facebook page. Outside of the 2 main structured procurement processes, we also have the opportunity for expression of interest, which is when we're trying to understand the best solution for a procurement process that we're undertaking. And an expression of interest can then obviously lead into other procurement processes, whether it be a request for quote or a public tender process. How does Council communicate the opportunities? All procurement tender opportunities are via the e-Tenderlink portal. So registering for Tenderlink is free and can be done at the link shown on this slide here with the blue underline. When we seek lower threshold works, our officers will use known businesses along with providing opportunities to those businesses that have now registered on our Moorabool localised platform. The registration process for Tenderlink is very straightforward and simple. It asks a number of questions in relation to your ABN number, your legal organisation name, and an email address that we can reach out to you on. Once you've entered in those first round of registration information details for Tenderlink, it will then seek just some additional information for your profile. So postal address, phone number, contact name, and it enables you to set up a password for that access. Once you've done that, you'll then just need to acknowledge the terms of services and select Register Me. The final registration process within that Tenderlink portal will require you to select the region within Australia that you want to receive information on and the industries that you're interested in receiving notifications on, whether that be consulting, landscaping, capital works, building development, engineering, those kinds of things. You'll then be presented with a screen showing your selections. You just need to check that you've selected everything correctly, and you will be issued with an email explaining the validation of registration. So the Tenderlink process, then every time Council posts a tender through that portal, and it's within one of those categories that you've selected as relevant to yourself, you will receive a notification that Council is undertaking a procurement process in that space. The other initiative that I mentioned earlier is our Mirrabul Localised initiative that Council is trying to encourage as many local businesses to register within the Shire as possible. Again, it is a free directory and it's relying on each of our businesses making sure they go in there if any of their details change. But it provides an opportunity to people to go there to figure out who is local within different industries so that we can try and keep our spend local. There'll be a number of initiatives that our economic development team will be running now and into the future to continue the awareness of that program. And it will form part of our training and development program with all of our internal staff so that we can utilise any businesses registered on there for our request for quote processes. So the controls that we apply to procurement, there's obviously a number of tiers that we have. So the overarching is our legislative framework, then our policy and underlying guidelines. So when we look at all three of those frameworks together, we result in a document and a documented process for all officers to follow, which outlines our values and principles, our value for money processes, our internal controls, how we support our local business, and ensuring that we comply with all of those frameworks and focus on a continuous improvement model. So at the moment, our procurement policy is under review and it is scheduled to be presented at the November ordinary meeting of Council. And that new policy is in accordance with the new Local Government 2020 legislative framework. Our existing procurement thresholds. So our 0 to 100 requires no quotes. 101 to $5,000 requires one verbal quote. $5,001 to $50,000 requires 3 written quotes. 50,000 to 150 for goods and services requires 3 written quotes and a project brief, or if it's for works, it can go up to 200,000. And then anything above 150 for goods and services and 200,000 for works is via the public tender process. As I mentioned earlier, Council may undertake an expression of interest process prior to issuing a tender or RFQ process, and that can either result in a public or what we call a select tender process. So a select tender process would be that we just engage with providers that participated or responded to that expression of interest process. It is important to note that public tenders may be one stage, multi-stage, or can be either of those combinations at any time. It is also worth noting that thresholds also look at the cumulative spend. So when I talk about cumulative spend, that means that we're talking about spend over a period of 3 years for the same type of service or goods or works. So if we're regularly undertaking spraying on roadsides and over a 3-year period, the spend in that space requires a tender. That is the process that we would undertake to ensure our compliance going forward in that space. So we often go out and we make it clear within our tender documentation whether we're seeking a single contract or a panel of suppliers, and it depends on what the procurement process is, what we will be seeking and how we need to be able to seek it. Some of the reasons that we go for a panel is it might be something like our trade services where we have a number of sites across the municipality that we need to maintain. And the travel costs from one end of the Shire to the other can be significant depending on where that plumber is primarily based, or also their capacity to address any urgent repair or maintenance requirements. So by having a panel, it allows us and provides an opportunity for us to share the spend within that category across multiple providers. The other variable that we have within our tender and procurement process is our lump sum approach or a scheduler rate. So what does it mean? It just means depending on the project, goods, services or works will depend on whether we seek a lump sum cost or a schedule of rates. When we talk lump sum, that means there will be no change to the price put forward by the contractor, and there'll be that the price submitted will not be subject to fall and rise, and it will be expected that the appointed supplier will deliver the required milestones for that project or goods, service or works within their submitted price. The schedule of rates contract obviously requires different rates for different services and allows for variability within the service that we are seeking, but it should always align back to the goods and services that we have sought within that tender procurement process. So when a tender comes out, I guess one of the key questions is always understanding whether you should take the time to submit a tender response. And there's a number of processes and thought maps that you probably need to go through when you have a look at it. And you need to make sure that you have read the scope, that you make sure that you ask any questions that you have in relation to the scope or the key deliverables. And whether there's anything that you need to declare as part of your response if you were to put a response in. And it's obviously critical that you understand that you can achieve and deliver what is being sought, not only from a pricing perspective, but the expected time frame, whether you've got the right resources and experience to be able to successfully deliver that requirement. Obviously, gaining or being successful in a tender process means different things for different businesses. And it is important that you consider that as part of your decision-making process. And if you've made any assumptions within your pricing or response process, please make sure that you outline what those assumptions are, so that if we don't understand or we don't believe your assumption is correct, we can take the opportunity to clarify that with you. So once the tender period has closed, how is your tender submitted being evaluated? Within each public tender process that we put out there, most tenders will have a mandatory criteria component and a scored weighted evaluation criteria. From the mandatory perspective, it's normally around OHS compliance, insurance requirements, or any licenses or permit requirements that might be associated with what we are seeking. The evaluation of that component is as basic as pass fail. Have you addressed your compliance to those mandatory components, and do you meet the requirements within that space? If we put the tick and the pass on each of those mandatory compliance components, we then move forward and start evaluating based on the scored weighted phase of that evaluation. So from a scored weighted criteria perspective, there's normally a minimum of 3 evaluation criteria. There can quite often be more. It just depends on what we are seeking and how we're considering evaluating that project, good, service or works. So when we look at the price, when we have a provider or a supplier put in that is deemed local in accordance with our procurement policy, in that evaluation template, there's a 5% reduction that comes off that price for our local suppliers to recognise the different challenges they have being within a regional area versus some of their metro counterparts. Some of the other scored weighted criteria will then look at your capacity, your company history, can you deliver within the required timeframes? And then we'll do a lot of focus around what your past experience and your ability to deliver other projects of a similar nature have been and the quality that you've delivered within that space. The procurement policy within the proposed new legislative framework does outline exactly how many officers have to evaluate different submissions depending on the value and the complexity of the procurement. So at the lower base procurement, where it's just a request for quote process, may only be 1 responsible officer evaluating, but from a tender procurement process, there's a minimum of 3 officers on that panel evaluating each submission. So supporting local through the evaluation, as I touched on that previous years, we have the 5% reduction on the price submitted only for the purposes of the evaluation. And it provides a reasonable effort to support local whilst complying with trade practice and competition principles. So moving forward, further initiatives being considered are tender response schedules, which extracts further information from our potential suppliers about whether they're employing any local people, whether they're issuing any subcontracts out to local business, and whether they're gaining any product or material from a local business. That will all be considered as we progress forward in our supporting local initiatives within our procurement policy. The other thing to consider from a state government perspective, they have an initiative which is known as Local Jobs First. It applies to certain projects that have state funding that meet certain criteria that the state puts out. But if we are in receipt of the funding that applies to those projects, this policy does come into play and needs to be considered through the evaluation process. And it aims to promote employment and business growth for each local area. So again, another supporting factor for our local business. If this does apply, council will declare that this policy applies to the particular project, procurement, good, service or work when we go out with that tender documentation, and it is again measured through the evaluation process within that procurement. So moving into what our tender documentation looks like, part one of our tender documentation is with only a couple of pages long, and it is just a pure invitation. Provides an overview of what we were seeking, the type of contract, whether there'll be any specific briefings or site inspections to help inform or guide potential suppliers. And it also outlines what council's complaint procedure is if someone's not happy with the process that we've followed for that particular procurement process. Part two of our tender document is all about what the conditions of that tender process is, who you can direct inquiries to, when the tender will close, what happens if you miss that close period, how you have to submit a tender, the clauses to help potential suppliers to know how to ensure what they are responding to and what to do if they need further information. It addresses all of the confidentiality, canvassing, probity, anti-competitive conduct, improper assistance or conflict of interest or variation requirements. And it also outlines your requirement to complete each tender response schedule, which is quite critical in us progressing forward and considering your submission. And it also outlines how long the tender will remain valid once you make that submission. In addition to the conditions section within that part, there is a schedule which then provides some further specific information in relation to this particular tender or procurement process, including that mandatory and scored evaluation criteria that I mentioned each submission would be evaluated on previously. So part three of our tender is all about the detail of what we are seeking. It's the contract specification. So what is required, what resources, capacity, whether you have the experience to be able to deliver, what costs are associated it, and what do you need to submit to ensure that you're successful. So it's that full scope of work for the process, any key performance indicators, service levels or milestones, whether there'll be any asset management maintenance system involvement within the process that you need to comply with, the required skills, experience and qualifications that you'll need within your organisation to successfully deliver, and any other reference documents that maybe council conduct, code of conducts or policies or strategies that will underpin those projects, goods, services or works. And then obviously what remains as confidentiality and intellectual property. So part four is all about what the conditions are that will be aligned to that project. So there's different types of conditions depending on the type of tender that we undertake, and it will be variable depending on what we're trying to achieve with that procurement process. But ultimately the conditions set the framework for which will apply to the life of the contract. Part five is all about the response schedules. So Critical to your submission being appropriately considered, we would encourage you to review and consider that scope of works, the specification, and then make sure when you look at the response schedules that you're appropriately responding and completing each schedule so that we can evaluate your submission appropriately. Once you've prepared your response, completed all your schedules, revised your set schedules, please make sure you submit in accordance with the information within that tender by the required date, time, and the different platform that you need to submit it by. I just want to also point out here, the failure to complete any of those schedules may deem that your submission is invalid and we can't evaluate it. So it is quite critical. If you're having difficulty ever completing any of those response schedules, you can always reach out to the nominated person within that contract to clarify or confirm what is required of you within those schedules. Which I've just covered this slide here. So the importance of the tender response, quite critical to making sure that you do have a valid submission that we can evaluate. If through the open tender period we deem that we've overlooked providing sufficient information on a particular item, we may issue what we call a tender addenda. This will always be issued through that TenderLink portal. So as long as you've registered in that portal, you've downloaded the tender documents through that portal, you'll automatically receive those addenda documents with the additional information. And the reason that we do it through that process is to make sure that everyone has the same information to be able to appropriately respond to that tender. So I've just put a little bit of a tender checklist together for you. As I said, this document and recording will be made available on our website in the future. So this will always be a reference point for you. Obviously critical, registered to receive your information via TenderLink. You can do that at any time. The earlier slides talk you through how you go about doing that. Making sure that you've read the tender specification and associated conditions. Can you deliver and comply? Have you addressed all of the mandatory criteria that's outlined within that tender procurement documentation? Have you accurately responded to the scored selection criteria? Have all response schedules been completed and signed as required? Have you reviewed and addressed any addendas issued during the open tender period? Have you contacted any of your referees to verify they're happy to be referee for you? And have you allowed appropriate time to submit by the required date? So once the tender has closed, the nominated evaluation panel members will all complete a signed conflict of interest declaration form. They will go through and read each submission, making sure that it meets any of the mandatory criteria and determine if any clarifications are required from the submitting business. If we do have tender clarifications, the evaluation panel member will collate all of those, and we will try and do that as a consolidated panel and approach you as a single business to provide that clarification for us so that we can appropriately evaluate your submission. And we do normally apply a further time frame on that just so that we can keep the project progressing forward. In some cases, we will also seek suppliers to come in for an interview, and that again is a further opportunity for our evaluation panel to ask questions regarding the submission, understand any complexities associated with the project, and make sure that the business has considered all of those and just clarify any assumptions that they have made through their submission. The tender evaluation process. Each evaluation panel member will score each supplier's submission based on the scored evaluation criteria within the procurement documentation. A score between 0 and 10 is applied to each criteria and then multiplied by the weighting defined for that criteria. Once each panel member has completed the scoring, the score is averaged and each submission is ranked based on highest score. So there's just a little overview of the different scorings and rankings that may apply. For the evaluation recommendation, once the evaluation is complete, each panel member have to sign off on a recommendation report. The report's then presented to the relevant general manager for recommendation approval, and depending on the value of the contract for the life of the contract, including extensions, will depend on the path of approval. So if it's up to 500,000, our chief executive officer can sign off on that contract. If it's above that value, it will go to council for formal approval. What happens if you're unsuccessful? After the contract is approved by the CEO or council, the responsible officer will issue a letter to the successful supplier and all of the unsuccessful suppliers and will commence preparation of contract documentation. You can obtain feedback on where you could improve your submission for future submissions. And the feedback that you may receive might be that your price was too high and we might give you a percentage range, or we might say that you didn't provide sufficient information for us to appropriately evaluate a certain evaluation criteria. But you'll be able to get some good indications about what you can do to improve the outcome for future opportunities. Where to go for further information? So within each procurement process advertised on Tenderlink, there is a council representative name and contact details within that document. General information regarding procurement is on our website. Social media, we regularly share what procurement and tender processes we're undertaking. And if you've got specific questions from the procurement team, there's an email number there, and obviously you can contact the office at any time and ask to speak with one of our procurement team regarding any potential opportunities to work with council.